We are on the lunch break in the questioning of Julian McKinney at the undercover policing inquiry. He was the Detective Chief Inspector of the Special Demonstration Squad from 2005 and went on to be a superintendent over the unit as well. I think it's fair to say it's been one of the most revealing of the witnesses. He is clearly someone who has been following the evidence of the inquiry very closely. He took the opportunity to make a direct apology to Maya, Lindsay and Donna McLean for the sexual abuse that they received at the hands of officers he was in charge of, specifically Rob Hastings and Carlos Sarachi. He said he referred to the sexual abuse as state-sponsored rape. Which is highly unusual for anybody from the SDS to say that. He claimed to have no knowledge of any of the undercover sexual abuse, but I see he still went much further than anybody else we've heard from. There was a huge amount that he talked about that we'll get into the detail of. We're joined for the first time by Tina, who's first time on one of these, and Donald Driscoll undercover policing inquiry. Tina, what did you make of what you had to say?
Close. It was
close. It's not very good.
Yeah, it was a lot more interesting than yesterday.
Yes, very much.
He answered almost everything. There was only one or two moments when he was like, it was a long time ago, I'm struggling to recall, but almost everything he was answering. And he had some very strong words about the sexual misconduct. He apologized, which for all it's worth.
You're going to have to get a lot closer.
They're
not very good quality.
They're not very good. I can't remember now. I wrote so much stuff down, but the state-sponsored rape was what stayed in my mind. Really stood out in my mind. He didn't just say it in the room; he'd written it in his report. Sorry.
Yeah, no worries. I think we were taken through, because of his background as in covert intelligence generally, and the fact that he had been involved in criminal undercover deployments. He talked a lot about the training, the lack of training. He claimed that day one, the very first thing that he did when he came into the SDS was saying, why are they not doing the NATAC course, which is the National Undercover Training Accredited Centre, training course, which he said that they should have had that. I mean, it was pointed out to him pretty quickly that, the NPORU officers had that. That didn't stop them committing sexual abuse, to which he said, no, admittedly, that's true, but this should have been like sort of the beginning of this whole process. They should have had that. He talked about the various ways in which management lacked a handle, had no grip on the unit. We saw, kind of reports of the financial mismanagement, essentially, that was happening inside the unit. It was put to him that so many of the officers he was a manager of had been incredibly critical of him, and referred to this toxic environment. He said that he was upset and surprised to learn that. He was taken through about the deployment of HM118, Simon Wellings, who he thought was a very good officer, which I thought was quite unique. I don't think anybody thought he was a good officer before.
He didn't have a sexual relationship, so
that is, I guess, like kind of the base level stuff. He said that he felt that the deployment deployments were too long. Simon was undercover for 7 years. He said it's far too long. Should have been much shorter. I think he undermined his comments about the sexual abuse and state-sponsored rape by talking about how, well, it's human nature. People are undercover for so long, and even in a committed relationship, you can have arguments at home, and then you've merged into your group, and you've got this sort of Stockholm syndrome that might cause you to do things which you otherwise wouldn't. It's human nature. I'm no psychologist, which I think was really mouthed, for a better word.
I thought that was quite interesting because he was essentially saying the management didn't have a grip on this, and he told us like, well, if you do put somebody into these groups, they start associating with groups, and they start, getting a divided personality almost, and he was pointing out, it's like, this is an inherent flaw with this process, and nobody was picking up on it. So, to me, that was, he was going towards the recommendations and, trying to say, well, what was part of what was going wrong here?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we had also had a lot of talk about, there was a breach this morning, but in the last section we didn't have any, but he was asked a question about how the SDS was meant to segue from being a unit that traditionally reported on public order into combating terrorism, as was meant to be the case. He said, he couldn't answer that without going into the other area, and we moved on from it. But certainly his whole thing about modernising the unit, about updating it, about changing it, which he talked about how resistant the undercover officers were to that. He blamed his managers quite a bit on that.
I wrote down some things. He said that the undercover officers were hostile to change and very proud of their history. And when you were talking about the lack of training in line with the National Police Service that they'd had, what I found interesting yesterday and today is that they really love to compliment each other. Like they'll talk about they were excellent officers. They were what was the crown jewel of
the crown jewel of Special Branch.
They were very free with giving praise, but then they also claim to not really know what's going on. So it's like, how can you be so confident that they're so excellent and so good at their jobs, and then claim so much ignorance about what they actually do and what the intelligence they're gathering is? They just seem very free with their praise and then very hands off with like knowing what was actually happening.
Yeah, I mean, he admitted that he may have seen one or two raw reports over his time, in the unit, but that, like, that for the most part, he wasn't looking at the intelligence reports. And he apportioned a lot of blame to the sergeants, the detective inspector. And we saw the complaints by some of the undercover officers that, he wasn't present. He was on floor 17 of Newcastle Scotland Yard, and with Frankie Flood, both of them were not present with the unit. And therefore they had no real oversight. He claims that his knowledge of the widespread and the volume and the depth of the abuse that happened was only when that final report was written.
He said after the SDS had been shut down, how to make the official language, is when he came across the Tradecraft Manual, which he had very strong words about how disgusting it was.
He like the way that he talked about it was as if like he kind of found it, and then they marched it off to the Department of Professional Standards and was like, somebody needs to look into this. But then it became clear that this was after the unit had shut. So it was kind of like, horses bolted, mate.
He did kind of acknowledge towards the end there before we broke for lunch. Sorry,
just not going to work otherwise.
I did like that they acknowledged the kind of irony or hypocrisy that they're an intelligence unit, but they didn't have a lot of intelligence about what was going on. They're meant to be highly trained, highly skilled detectives, and yet they didn't seem to have much of a clue what their undercover officers were doing. And he did kind of acknowledge that had him questioning his own abilities.
It was a question that was put to him by Don Ramble, which I really feel that question should have been put to all the former managers. Was that what was the conversation between the former SDS managers after this all came out into the press? What were you talking about? And he said they were all shocked. They were all so shocked about what had gone on. But what he found particularly incredible was it was the people who had been spied on. Who had discovered all this, and how would they, without all the knowledge of what the actual deployments were about, how would they manage to find out? And them trained detectives had not, and he accepted that it wouldn't be credible to people that they, as trained detectives, hadn't been aware. Which it isn't, and we don't accept it. I think that's really important.
Is he putting on a really convincing act about how ignorant they all were? Or were they actually that incompetent? He seemed quite genuine. I was inclined to believe what he was saying, but I'm also like, is this all an act because you don't want to admit how complicit the management were in what you did to us? Or are we supposed to believe that you are all these excellent professional officers, so highly trained, and yet so incompetent that you didn't know what was going on?
I think that's like really key, really, that kind of because his demeanor is so unguarded. He is talking in a way in which suggests that he's like, look, here's all the things I know. But this consistent denial of knowledge of. He did say that that the handover from Mike Dell was 1 day. And he said, we're all different. When I did my handover, it was 3 months. But, I only had 1 day, but I don't want to criticize Mike Dell. He felt that was sufficient. But he claims, that he had no knowledge of the historic abuses that had taken place. And that, the way that he talks about finding out through the press. And then he claims that once it came out in the press, he went back and went through like the litigation of Officer AB, which was Peter Francis and HM123. He went back through the reports that HN81, Windmill Tilter, as his code name, that Dave Hagan had done about the Lawrence Family Justice Campaign, and he said, 20% of his reports were at Dwayne Brooks. He singled out the mentions about Suresh Grover. He was like, I worked with Suresh Grover on criminal cases in the past. He found very helpful. He's like, couldn't believe that he was being targeted. I don't know if I believe him. The problem is that so many of the witnesses here are so fucking awful.
Yeah.
They are such blatant liars. They are so guarded in everything they say. They are so demanding to know the reference of what's written down, what's not. Having a witness who is engaging with the process in a respectful manner, really, it's hard not to go like, oh, this is good, but I don't know how much I believe him.
So I think one of the things with him is he is an undercover specialist. It's at the moment it's all focused on the SDS, but before that he's SO10. Frankie Flood, who we heard a lot about, helped create the new tech course, that's undercover training thing. So these are people for who undercover policing is their blood, and this taints everything. And you can see that they have no hesitation in cutting ties. And part of the way of doing this is say, well, it's a special branch thing. This is not a metropolitan police, not anything else. And they're not special branch officers, so they don't have that loyalty. The way that all the other special branch officers, even Jack Williams, who's a relative outside, was like, oh, I had special branch. They were all good officers. They were perfect. I could trust them. And one of the interesting questions that came up was, well, how much of this was based on trust? And and you could see that he'd come into a unit, a legacy special branch unit, which was still operating on the principles of we're a family. We've got, as I said this morning, they've got their omerta, and he's doing the respectful. My reading is he's doing the respectful thing of trying to break it down, but they're just going, we don't need anything. We don't need training. He's going, you at least need to know the law on undercover policing. That's at least on the new tech course. You would have got, this is the law. This is what you're allowed to do. He could have, and he did admit he should have been a lot more intrusive. He was a bit too hands-off. But
I liked, he did say when him and Frankie Flood came in, actually this might have been before the break, but it sounded like two officers who'd been trained outside in undercover policing outside of the special branch have come in to this unit that's had very little oversight, not a lot of connection with the rest of the National Policing Service. And he said that I don't remember if it was him or Frankie Flood or both of them in agreement with each other, said it was the land that time forgot. So they're kind of acknowledging that they've just been doing things, they're quite set in their ways. They've been doing things their own way for decades with very little input. And now things have to change because of the new regulations that have come in. And he seemed actually very concerned. I thought that he was maybe going to get into the sexual misconduct then, but he seemed more concerned that they were not working longer hours than as opposed to more like human resources concerns.
I think part of the bit that he's not going into in this delivery strand, I think I won't go in say too much more about this, but this is just after 7/7.
Yeah.
The whole framework is changing. He's going, it's like, we're putting loads of resources into this unit. Yeah. What are we getting out at the same time?
Yeah.
Everybody's caught with the pants down. Everybody's looking at the police, like, how didn't you predict this? You had an undercover, on the same street that the 7/7 ones and you missed it.
Yeah.
That was in Mutton. And, so there's, and the SDS are going, but and he loses. So they've still got the 1970s mindset of Reds under the beds, and there's a nice line he said about where once they get into the groups, they start assuming that they're the more important, and they start assuming more important, and they in their own minds they've got this perception of how important their groups are and things. Which is true. Every group thinks they're the vanguard of the revolution, but and you say, well, the officers doing that thing, they haven't got the perspective on their own deployments.
Yeah, I thought that was really telling, this idea that the undercover officers got an overblown sense of their own importance the longer they were deployed. And he was asked, did you notice any sort of psychological changes in the officers? And I noticed a change in attitude. They got really self-important essentially. And I mean, I think he was saying that in terms of the importance of the group they were in and the intelligence was delivering, but also in the importance of their own personal importance,
which we really saw in Robert Hastings.
100%.
That guy believes in himself above and beyond, like he was untouchable.
Yeah, and I think we definitely saw it as well with Jim Boyling.
Yeah,
this idea that like he was like the absolute like there's something so important. And as Julian McKinney said, it at the end of the day, these are just intelligence deployments that they're one node offering a capability that comes and goes, and that that actually obviously they need to be protected, but their importance is actually quite limited, which. I mean, I think I think it was a rare moment of honesty generally in this entire process of the disposable nature of these officers, something which they clearly never really recognise and make out that they're so super important. I just want to talk about also one of the things which we were saying about like kind of do we believe him or not about the knowledge of the sexual relationships. It is pointed out that he and Flood looked into bringing in support role players to act as girlfriends to these officers.
Imagine how that would have gone down. Oh, this is my partner. Well, this is your partner that you've been with 5, 6, 7 years, and you're going to introduce some undercover officer as your girlfriend when you've got 2 girlfriends that are very involved in the movement already.
Well, quite. But I mean, in terms of the idea that he said, I was aware that there was a risk in terms of the legend and the conversations they would be having with their target group about where their girlfriends were, and this was to help them out with that. But I never believed that professional police officers would be having sexual relationships. And it's like, well, if you've got to point 1 in that thought experiment, then surely you've got to point 2. And I think that it was that area there. He said he also has a memory of telling undercover officers that sexual activity was not permitted, and he would withdraw them if he found out about it. And again, another sign to me that he must have realised, he must have known. I don't think it's credible to say that there was really no knowledge, at the very least, that it hadn't happened in the past.
And there was, he also on that point he said. But the effect of that was that they weren't going to tell me. And then you're right, there's the chink in the armor. It's like he's also setting up a defense as why they didn't come to tell him. Not just that they hated him for being an outsider. It's just like I wouldn't have told me because they knew they would have been straight off the job. Not so sure.
Yeah, it comes down to that old-fashioned thing of kind of when there's one. If you give this is why I haven't done something. Fair enough. If you give 3, 4, 5 layers of reasons, then it's like the lady does protest too much. Methinks. I don't really buy it. It's very clear that he is following the rest of the evidence of the inquiry. He has referred to things that have come up in numerous witnesses' testimonies. He talks about the cousin of Jean-Jacques de Mendes, Patricia de Silva, who he ended up giving an apology saying it should never have happened. There should have been no spying on family grief. He said that a policy should have been written specifically about the matter of family grief that would have prevented any of the undercover police reporting on it. I think it's. The problem with it is he's not saying that the undercover officers shouldn't have imposed on that grief. He's saying they shouldn't have recorded the fact they had, which I think really misses the point of what's wrong with these deployments. And it's not just that the information turns up in police reports, it's the lived experience of people who are there having this person in their lives. The fact that, from what we understand, when it comes to the NPORU, these are things. There is more of this sort of thing where there's a break in the reporting because someone's attended a funeral or something. That doesn't stop the undercover officer being there and being part of those people's lives. And I think really, I think he misses the point on that. I think it's something which needs to be brought up, could have been brought up with him, should have been brought up with him. Hopefully something in Rule 10 will pick that issue up. But it's clear that he's very aware of of what's happened. It's a relief to hear a former manager of this unit talk about how his oversight of it after it ended, following the news stories about it, going back and checking the reports because he was able to when other people weren't. And I'm sure they're all doing this. I don't believe that when he said, the conversations we have, everybody was shocked. I'm not convinced by that, but the fact that he is speaking to it is refreshing.
Yeah. He did seem whatever his motivations, he did seem engaged in the process. Like he knew what was going on, which was a stark contrast to yesterday, where I've never seen this document. I don't remember writing that. I don't remember saying that. I don't recall anything. And it's like she just barely showed up. She hadn't put in any effort to be accountable to the inquiry. So yeah, for whatever his reason is, he does at least seem to be engaging in the process of the undercover policing inquiry.
And he also comes across as a bit more professional in that he's able to talk about the difference between information and intelligence. Which, when you read the policing material around this, the national intelligence model and stuff, there, it's very clear. It's like you have information, and then how you turn it into intelligence. And it's like, well, so you're there, you gather information. You need to have a filter to turn it into intelligence. He actually understands what it is to do intelligence gathering, and like. Again, he's the first officer who's actually, particularly the managers who were meant to oversee this. Well, you did actually think about this. You did actually have an understanding, and so when he says this is simply not credible and then you should never get, it comes across with more credibility because he does have that reference.
Yeah. There's more to come from this witness. He will be back again for this afternoon. I'm frustrated again that it's such a short time with him. There's already been there's been so many things he's been asked about that I'm like, I want to know more about that because he is giving actual answers in stark contrast to so many other witnesses. I kind of feel like there ought to be like kind of a vibe check with each witness of like kind of, you can answer questions. Oh, you are? Well, then you're back in tomorrow. Because the willingness to engage with the process is so rare in all this. But yeah, he will be back later on. We'll react to it. Is there anything else you'd like to add about what we've heard today so far?
There's like a million things I could add, but I think
Go on.
No. My brain is. I think we should get back.
Okay.
Yeah, coffee and lunch.
I'm just so relieved to have had a witness that
Actually talked.
I'm not headbutting the computer screen in frustration. Good.
Yeah, no, it makes a change. I mean, I think there's a lot of the smaller details that we obviously haven't. There was so much that came out of the last session. I'm sure there's lots of things we've missed, but we will come back to a lot of it, I'm sure.
So, it should be going. We have been asking for those control strategies that set all of this. And it's like this is something that's been very hard to get any response on, but he actually set out why they're so important and why we actually need to see it, because for this entire period of undercover policing, they set the strategy, they set the tasking, and everything that SDS is supposed to be doing is meant to be mirroring that. So the degree to which they're straying is really significant.
Yeah, absolutely. I think as well, I would just highlight again, it came up again about the disruption. One of the reasons why he talked about HM118, Simon Wellings, being such a good officer is that he was so good at disruption. And that was a strength again, which it's already got to the point where we're seeing multiple documents now that talk about this disruption being positive. Why weren't these shown to previous witnesses?
Yeah, but that Simon Wellings was also down to his teeth while he was in the groups. There's still one of the things they did bring again is a question should have gone to so many other managers is a human right to protest. It's Articles 10 and 11. And he actually goes, well, yeah, there is a democratic legitimate right. If I'm going to use this in my closing, he's one of the very few, if not the only one, for whom that was raised. And he went, yeah, it's an important consideration.
Thanks for joining us. I'm going to do another video after this one's finished and after I have my lunch, but about what's been happening, what the press conference has happened today in Barcelona about the deployment of undercover officers by the Spanish state. There's a lot of development there, a lot to talk about. We'll come back to that. I'll do another video for that. Please watch out for that. But yeah, please follow Gun this afternoon. I'm sure there's a lot more to come from this witness. Bye for now.